Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, this is the Rain Man. Before we get started with my next interview, just want to give a quick shout out to everybody who has been watching my YouTube videos. I really appreciate it. If you could press the like button and subscribe if you are happy with our content, because that helps us in the future to provide more enjoyable interviews, which is exactly what we have today. My guest today is Mark Montgomery, and I wanted to have Mark on as a cybersecurity expert. I wanted to have Mark on to talk about everything that's been going on recently with the cyber attacks, as well as what our government response is going to be about those attacks. Mark is a retired Navy admiral. He is the senior director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And most importantly for this conversation, he is the senior advisor to the chairman of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And they put out a report called the CSC Report 2020 that gave recommendations for the Biden administration in terms of how to counter and how to be forward thinking as far as the cyber threats are concerned. So I wanted to have Mark on, and let's start off, Mark, by giving us a little bit about your background and then how you got involved with the CSC.
Sure, thanks. So I was in the Navy 32 years, a surface nuclear trained officer, so ran nuclear reactors on aircraft carriers and served on destroyers, commanded a destroyer in the McCampbell, a destroyer squadron, and then eventually a carrier strike group embarked on board the Ronald Reagan, the George Washington. My brain wasn't working there for a second. But I served in two combatant commands in U.S. European Command as a one-star in the J5, and then as the director of operations at J3 as a two-star at U.S. Pacific Command. When I was at U.S. Pacific Command, I met frequently with Senator McCain. He came through every year, or usually twice a year, on visits out to Asia. And near the end of my tour there, my boss, Admiral Harry Harris, told McCain I was getting ready to retire. And McCain had a couple of years before said, "Hey, you got to come work for me. You know, you share my concern about a few things and our focus on the national security strategy." And I said, "Yeah, I'd be interested." And so when he found out I was retiring, he sat me down, said, "Let's have breakfast." And over breakfast, said, "Why don't you come work for me?" I kind of gave him a think about it, and then next day his staff was on me like, he heard you say yes. I was like, well, kind of. And what was amazing to me was that how fast you can get hired inside the congressional system. Within a week or two, the paperwork was done. So I retired for the Navy about a month later, and then during my terminal leave, went and worked at the U.S. Senate, something I used to be able to do. And so I worked for him for 2 NDAA cycles, almost 2 years, until he passed away. And then I worked for a short period of time for Senator Inhofe. As it happens, when new chairmen come in, they get rid of a lot of the staff of the old chairman. Sometimes it's different parties, sometimes it's not. Senator Inhofe was gracious enough to let me stay there a while, as we did a transition. And then Senator King, who was on the Armed Services Committee, knew I was leaving, and he had just been made selected to be one of the co-chairmen of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So at the time, there was just himself, Senator Sass, Representative Gallagher, Representative Langevin, and two of them were going to be chairman. So he asked me if I wanted to be chairman. And I knew a little bit about the commission because as a for Senator McCain, I worked as his policy director. But as things progressed in the the eventual changeover between him and Senator Inhofe, a lot of our staff went away and weren't replaced. And I became the cyber professional staff member. And so this and a bunch of other bills I had Sherpa'd through the he'll process. So I had general understanding of the bill. If I'd known I was going to be the executive director, I probably would have fixed the pay because it was pegged pretty low for the executive director, but in the executive schedule. But in any case, so I knew what I was doing. I did the last NDAA's cyber tasking, the 50 or 60 different legislative provisions that made up the cyber section of the bill. And so I had a reasonable understanding what the challenges were. And I said, all right, I'll take it. And probably most importantly, I understood how the House and Senate work. Because one of the things about in the Armed Services Committee is you really do work well across the aisle. It's real bipartisanship between the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. And there's good relations bicamerally with the House. And so I just described a condition that does not exist in any other set of committees historically, in my opinion. And as a result, King had seen that and seen my work in that and said, yeah, I'd like you to do this. And then I'd known Representative Gallagher a little bit, through Navy. He's a former Marine. He's the congressman from Wisconsin's 8th Republican congressman, and he was a young, a junior representative, but he'd seen a couple of the naval things. I'd worked through the NDAA as a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Representative Langevin I'd worked with a little bit because he is the cyber kind of guru of the Congress. In other words, he's got 20 years of experience just working cyber issues in Congress. He's by far the most knowledgeable and influential congressman on cyber. And then Senator Sass I'd worked with on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So I knew all four members. I said, sure, I'll do it. It's weird. Getting this committee set up was unusual. Senator McCain didn't like commissions. A commission is kind of an acknowledgement that the Congress and the executive branch couldn't get it done. But I think we'd reached that point where the Congress and the executive branch couldn't get it done. 8-10 years of trying different legislative remedies had not, gotten either the federal government secure or built the kind of public-private collaboration we knew we needed. The proof of this was in the different types of adversary action that were going on. This is in the 2018-2019 timeframe. We're looking at the Russian cyber-enabled information operations campaign against our elections in 2016. And then just a terrific amount of Chinese activity, the OPM theft in 2014-15. Admiral Blair just put out an intellectual property theft commission report. It was like a second or third update that, indicated upwards of $1 trillion in unrealized GDP loss to Chinese intellectual property theft. And, in the military, we know, the J-20 looks a lot like an F-20, 35 thing.
Right.
Now you see a little bit of it. It's much worse in the private sector. I mean, the degree to which they steal and or coerce the theft of intellectual property from companies and joint arrangements with them is significant. And this is well documented. And China is a majority of this kind of intellectual property theft. So hundreds of billions of dollars a year of that. There's the North Korean attack on Sony, which went largely unanswered there. And there was Iranian attacks on our banking system earlier in the decade. So all this kind of stuff told Senator McCain it's not working. So he said, okay, we'll do a commission. But he intervened. He said, there's going to be some rules to this commission. First one is it's short. You have 1 year to write your report. Second is your report's going to include legislative and policy recommendations. And you can't just write a report that says, here's our deep thoughts on the issue. You're going to have a detailed, legislative and policy recommendations. And third is I'm going to put 4 serving congressional members on this committee. And that's highly unusual before or since to have that, because McCain rightly saw that if you have these people, they can come back and transition the recommendations into law easily. So he said that. We went out. So now fast forward a few months and I'm working for Senator King. We were given 9 months. And so we had the 4 congressional commissioners, 4 executive branch. So the head of the FBI, the number 2 at Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and the Director of National Intelligence, and then 6 private sector people who are either former government employees or CEOs or academics. And so it's this great team of 14 commissioners. And we had a small staff of, under 20. And our job was in 1 year to get a report done. We actually got it done in about 9 months. And what we did was we immediately just started meeting weekly, the commission and the staff, full-time staff, we were huddled together. And we did about 400 interviews with companies industry associations, other governments, state and local governments, foreign governments, our own federal government, and kind of got an idea. Here's the lay of the land of what's wrong. We had two major propositions. One, I talked about those adversary attacks. How do you restore deterrence in cyberspace so that these attacks stop and make it so that we're not vulnerable to a significant cyber attack on our national critical infrastructure or our democratic institutions like our election system? And then what are these policy recommendations? So we did these interviews. We met as a commission about 40 times in that first year, 35 times in that first year. So almost every week, which for senators and congressmen, it's just a significant commitment. Right. And then had a offsite event where we got together with all the different kind of options for strategic approaches and all the different kind of options, recommendations, binned everything, voted it down, and then came up with a strategic approach and the associated recommendations, and put out a final report. It was put out March 11th, so about 11 months. The report itself was, after publication and printing and all that, it was put out March 11th. So about 11 months into our existence of last year of 2020. It was the last event in Congress before the kind of shutdown because of COVID. And so we got that out and then went on to the next level of work. But that's kind of how I got into it and how we got started.
So when did McCain establish the CSC, or was it already established and he just kind of took it to the next level? And on top of that, how long has the CSC been around? Kind of give me a little bit of a background about that.
So what happened from 2010 to 2018 was basically he and others tried to use normal legislative and executive branch remedies, and they failed. And that's why I was frustrated. Look, this is not a guy that took failure well, and 7-8 years of it. And he had a similar response on like getting a national defense strategy done right. He was very, in the end, he pretty much directed it in law and wrote the preamble, so to speak, and the outline for Secretary Mattis, and then handed it to him. Secretary Mattis did a great job handing it back as a completed document. But, when he got fixated, action was taken. So he got fixated in 2018, early 2018, and then it became law in fall of 2018. And then we stood up, I think, April 8th of 2019. So April 8th, we stood up. March 11th of 2020, we gave our report. That's the kind of 11 months. And so, so how long had he been worried about this? 10 years. How long had Congress been worried about it? About 24 years. Congress, stood up a commission to look at this issue in 1996 called the Marsh Commission, produced a report in 1997. I happened to work at the White House then, and we produced national security documents responding to that report back in 1998, 1999. Sadly, many of the recommendations I made in that report in 1998, 1999, if we made 75 recommendations in that report, 60 of them were maybe 50 plus of them were still active. 2/3 of what we recommended in 1999, 2000, were not properly acted on. And that is a problem here. And you think of any other warfare area, it doesn't work like that in the government, particularly in the military. Yeah. But for whatever reason, we kind of accepted this low level of critical infrastructure protection. I mean, I'll give you a good philosophy. My philosophy why is this, that when you think about cyber threat, it's a paradigm shifter. Any other threat, tanks, planes, fighter jets, submarines, you've got 4,000 miles of Atlantic, 7,000 miles of Pacific, good relations with Canada and Mexico. You're protected. You're geographically protected from the threat. Cyber just breaks that paradigm. It shows up instantaneously from anywhere in the world to you. And in fact, uses your own infrastructure as it moves around. And so we just weren't intellectually ready to deal with that, I think, and until now. And we still struggle on occasion.
So I imagine back then in the late 90s, people probably didn't realize just how forward thinking your group was. I mean, we're at the very beginning stages of the internet and becoming really a major part of our lives. I have to imagine that back then they probably didn't take much of this stuff very seriously.
I think there was a lot of, there was a lot of not my problem.
Yeah.
This will be solved elsewhere.
So before we get into the CSC report 2020, just kind of give you an idea, how did the Trump White House do? I mean, how did they handle this when you brought this all to their attention?
I'd say it's mixed. In this, there were parts. Look, when John Bolton was National Security Advisor, he took a couple steps that were counterproductive. He significantly reduced the role of the cyber coordinator. He axed the Homeland Security coordinator. And then demoted the role of the cyber coordinator to such a degree, significantly, reduced the size of the number of people involved in the issue through attrition. And so I think in a way took some of the strategic, NSC has the ability to provide strategic leadership. I mean, the White House has the ability to provide strategic leadership. Often in national security areas, it's the NSC that does that. But I'll also say this, the answer was never going to come from the NSC because there's a lot of criticism of President Trump or National Security Advisor Bolton and the cybersecurity industry for what happened. And I'll say those were not good moves. On the other hand, it wasn't like those solutions were working. And they hadn't worked for President Obama, and they hadn't worked for President Bush, and they hadn't worked for President Clinton. There was one of the things we figured out during our work was that you really needed a kind of independent Senate-confirmed leader on the cybersecurity, someone who could work both with the legislator and the executive branch, kind of solve that conundrum that McCain couldn't solve, and provide strategic leadership from the White House, provide implementation guidance to the various federal agencies and departments, work with the private sector, but at the same time have the president's ear. The NSC can have some of that, the president's ear, some of the work with the federal agencies, but they can't do everything I just described. So in fairness to President Trump and National Security Advisor Bolton, while they made decisions I wouldn't have made, that is not why it wasn't functioning. And on many of our other recommendations, they were very supportive. And we did get quite a few. They did get some of the non-legislative recommendations, the executive branch ones, done during their time. So I'd say it's a mixed grade for them. But you'll often hear a very negative grade, and kind of my counter to that is, yeah, but against what, Mark, against what bell curve are you looking at? We haven't really succeeded in any administration trying to run it out of the NSC. And I say that as someone who was working cybersecurity in the NSC in the Clinton administration, and we didn't do it. And we had a guy named Richard Clark, who was a terrific, White House leader and had good administrative skills, and he couldn't get it done. So my take is that, a mixed bag for them.
Gotcha. So I read an article that just came out this week on the 19th by Senator King as well as Tom Fanning. And it was titled, "To Combat Cyber Attacks, the U.S. Government and Businesses Must Work More Closely." In your mind, what does that public-private partnership look like? And then how is the CSC trying to bring on the private sector to kind of get on board with what we're trying to accomplish here as far as implementing Report 2020?
This is going to be a long answer because I think I'd start back by saying our report's recommendation said that, hey, our strategic approach needed to be something called layered cyber deterrence. So that you take the normal aspects of deterrence, imposing cost, denying access to an adversary, and working with working to shape behavior. But you had to enhance them with three things, and you're hitting on one of them. The first thing you had to enhance was you actually had to defend yourself. Remember, I talked earlier about the geographic issue. You have to defend yourself. But that leads to an interesting conundrum for the United States. We don't own 85% of the national critical infrastructure. Now, we own 100% of the jet fighters, 100% of the submarines, 100% of the tanks. That's really easy for us. If there's a tank battle that's going to happen, the U.S. Army and to a lesser degree the Marine Corps are going to do it. If there's a submarine battle, the U.S. Navy is going to do it. But when there's this cyber battle about the critical infrastructure, now
So
it's
real quick,
80.
Mark, let me interrupt you real quick. What
Yeah.
is that critical infrastructure? Just what?
Yeah,
what
so
is
that
it about
we
that?
define it across 16 areas, but generally speaking, it's your electrical power grid, your financial services networks, your telecommunications networks, your cloud and ISP providers, your water and wastewater systems, your healthcare systems, your oil pipeline systems, your energy distribution as opposed to production systems. There's 4 or 5 others, but I mean, it goes on. So, these are, these 60 national critical infrastructures make up your national critical infrastructure. And a lot of what I just described is either owned by the private sector or by state and local municipalities. So that's now a problem, right? Because when it's owned by the Department of Defense, it's kind of easy. It's our job to do. We either decide we're going to defend it or not defend it, or move on, modernize, do something else. But you can't do that when it's owned and operated by somebody else. So you actually have to build that public-private collaboration. Now, that was our number one argument in 1998. It's our number one argument in 2020, because in the 22 years that have in between, we have done an ineffective job in building that public-private collaboration. And so, and the third one I'll get to, and then come back on this issue of ransomware and that collaboration. The third aspect of improving our deterrence was you actually have to maintain an offensive capability. There's this false dichotomy out there. Is it offense or is it defense? And the answer, of course, is both, as it is in almost all warfare areas. And in this, the idea of your offensive capability is your ability to impose cost, which is you could impose it economically through sanctions. Law enforcement, you could do it with indictments. Diplomatic, you could do it getting allies and partners on board with your sanctions and other effects. Or you can do it militarily, and that could be either cyber or non-cyber, responses. So you had to bring that whole offensive part together. We call it the defend forward concept. But in any case, those three things: defend yourself better, go to better public-private collaboration, and maintain a good defend forward offensive capability. If you do all three of those, you begin to set yourself up strategically. Now, you asked a very good question about what's going on between the government and the private sector, and especially in light of the Colonial attacks, the attack on the ransomware attack on Colonial. I would say, there are a lot of examples out there, whether it's SolarWinds, which was a espionage campaign, whether it's the Microsoft Exchange server hack, which was a Chinese espionage and theft campaign, the ransomware attacks at the meat packer or at the pipeline Colonial. There's a growing visible series of attacks that all demonstrate that we do not have effective cyber defense and we do not have an effective public-private collaboration. And look, that doesn't mean there aren't things that aren't well defended. I'll tell you right now, in the financial services sector, the top 8 US banks are really well defended in cyber. There's a good reason for that. They've been under cyber criminal attack for 20 plus years. Some of them spend upwards of $700 to $800 million a year in cybersecurity. That's more than most federal agencies except the Department of Defense. It's more than most countries in the world, individual US banks. You go into like some of the banks' ops centers, and it's like going into a 3 or 4 star ops center in terms of the visual and the situational awareness. Now, look, I can't guarantee they're operating well, but it looks good, and I suspect they're operating well. They really, they have their act together there. So that's not all banking. It's the top of banking. All banking's in better shape than most other infrastructure, but the top of banking is in fantastic shape. Energy production, particularly nuclear power production, things like that, are very heavily regulated by the Department of Energy. Concerns we've had with the Soviet Union and then Russia about cyber attacks have caused them to have very good security. The telecoms tend to have good security. But then you can go down to water, wastewater, where there's almost no security involved in that. And we saw that in the Oldsmar attack in Florida, which I'm sure we'll talk about some more in the future, but we've seen it in some other areas. So there's this inconsistency across it. It's interesting, if I was a little bit cynical, I would say I'm kind of happy about this ransomware, because ransomware is causing, the reason we had this inconsistent behavior across infrastructures was people didn't think they were vulnerable to attack. You tell them a story about China and Russia, like, what's China and Russia care about? The city of Bethesda's water system. Who cares? What do they care here about Vicks dry cleaner? Well, you're right. You probably aren't going to get attacked by China and Russia, but ransomware shows up, and ransomware has learned to monetize data. Here's what that means. Previously the banks, they were stealing actual money and moving it to other accounts, right? In ransomware, they've monetized your data. They don't have to move it anywhere.
Yeah.
They block your access to it, whether in your business operations or your field operations. So you either can't move the oil and gas around, or you can't account for it in your business operations. That's where the colonial attack was in the business operations. That's one way to monetize data. Here's another way. I can break into your system, grab all your CEO's emails, and sort through it looking for embarrassing discussions of cases you've had to settle. And I can blackmail you with release of those emails. A third way I could do it is if you own customers' PII, their socials and birth dates, I can threaten to release that. So there's 3 different ways I can monetize your data. Now, 95% of the critical infrastructure suddenly needs to care about cybersecurity. So in a weird way, or an unfortunate way, this ransomware is starting to get that first leg of the stool, which is defend yourself. There's starting to be an understanding among the private sector companies they need to defend themselves. Of course, ironically, this highlights that the federal government has not done a good job with that second leg of the stool, building the public-private collaboration to better allow them to defend themselves. When a company is spending 10% of its IT budget on cybersecurity, which is a good number, it would be nice if the federal government was sitting by them and say, thanks for doing that. And here's the information about threats. Here's patching information. Here's the latest we've seen about why someone would try to attack your sector. That kind of like tailored information and intelligence, that doesn't exist. We haven't built that kind of collaborative network to do it. And that there's a lot of work to be done there. We're starting to see the private sector move off the snide, get a little bit better at this. The government work has got to get more effective working with them.
So as I understand it, it sounds like the CSC is trying to have some kind of a rating level similar to the energy ratings, the Energy Star ratings that people have for buildings and energy efficiency. Is that what you're trying to do in terms of getting companies to meet certain levels of security rating?
So we had 82 recommendations. 50 of them were legislative, 30 were for the executive branch, and they're all a good number are being executed, more than 50% now, which is just phenomenal for a commission. One of them was a great one you're mentioning there, which is the idea of a national cybersecurity labeling authority, certification labeling authority. So that would say is if you build a product, kind of like we have in electricity, we have this, it's called Underwriter Laboratories. It's almost ubiquitous now. When you go buy something in a store, I guarantee you it's got the UL stamp on it. But 40 years ago, it was a choice whether you bought something with the UL stamp or not. And people, for safety and security purposes, did. Plus, you later find out your insurance company would punish you if the fire started in your house and you didn't have a grounded, UL circuit. But over time, that kind of government, that quasi-government stamp became ubiquitous. You mentioned another one, green energy. We're starting to see that a lot more. So we thought, hey, there could be something like this for cybersecurity that says the government says, here are the NIST standards. A third party assesses, some kind of maybe federally funded research development center or just a non-governmental organization that blessed by the government, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce would say, you use these NIST standards to ensure that products meet a certain cybersecurity products meet a certain standard, and they're a gold stars product. And then companies, small business, medium-sized businesses, or people like you and me, no, that's the one I ought to buy. Because the truth is, you can't read the side of a cybersecurity product and figure out, oh, this is a good product for me. This is the right. It's very hard to cut through all the kind of like lingo and marketing that's on the front of these to figure it out. But if you had a trusted third party saying, this is a gold star product, just like you don't really understand why your dryer or washer is green. I mean, you believe that it uses less water. You don't know how to measure the thickness of the orifice plates to know if that's true or not. So you have to trust a third party who says, we inspect and make sure it is. It'd be the same way with this. So that's one of our 50 legislative recommendations. I'll be honest with you, it's one we struggle to get done because everyone's nervous about it. The companies are like, who's going to set this standard? I'm doing good with my sales right now. Yeah. You don't call me a gold star product, I won't. So I'm nervous. I don't trust you, government, to kind of set this up. And I get that. And of course, the government's like, we really want to take this responsibility on. And so we say to them, you don't have to. We already do the standards through NIST. You get a third party to apply the NIST standards to the relevant products. And the problem with cyber is different than, say, your washer. You're using that green energy star. You never check it again, right? It isn't like there's not going to be some kind of, you're not going to get like an upgrade to your washer. They say, hey, go in and unbuckle this orifice plate, put a new one in, right? But on your software products, you get an upgrade every 90 days, 120 days, sometimes more frequently. And has this been rechecked? Is this, are we still gold star or not, with this? So there's a complexity to the cybersecurity problem that's making it hard for us to push that, but I believe in it. And I think long-term, there's value in that.
So who is going to be responsible for those ratings, and who's going to be responsible for developing the technology that these companies use to get to these different levels of security? Is that going to be a government thing, or is the government going to be investing in the private sector to come up with that technology?
I think no, it's going to be the private sector companies. They're already doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be honest with you. If you told me that the Department of Homeland Security was selling a cybersecurity product and Microsoft was on a cybersecurity product, I don't know that I'd go with the Department of Homeland Security, right? So, I think it's going to be them. In fact, as you well know, the government produces almost no cybersecurity product. I should say, I'd be careful here. In very specific military missions, we do produce some of our own software, and that's off in there. And I would just say that's a whole nother issue that we probably don't need to get into today. But there is some government software development going on, but the vast majority of cybersecurity software available to companies, humans, or even the non-DoD government is private sector cybersecurity.
That's a good point. So how is the military's cybersecurity? I mean, I would assume it's the top of the line. Is that right?
I don't assume that.
Okay, wow.
So here's what I'll tell you too. So we were very careful in our first year. So we had 82 recommendations. The first group was about helping get the military aligned properly. And look, the military is well ahead of .gov, the non-military government, and a lot of other areas. But they still have a lot of work to do. They would acknowledge they have a lot of work to do. And we help them with changes to law and authorities to help them be more effective. Some, trying to increase access to resources for certain things, authorities, appropriations. All those DoD ones we did last year. The other big thing we did last year was try to reorganize the federal government to be, the first thing we said is, before you bring in all kinds of new policies, you got to get the government organized, right? Because it wasn't. Part was creating this national cyber director to kind of strategically lead things for the president. This is the person that implements the president's national cyber strategy. There's 102 federal agencies that are not DoD. Shocking. And here I'm gonna give you some insight, which means there's probably 102 ways to approach cybersecurity, right? Because they're not aligned properly, and they just won't get in line with some of the federal agencies that are supposed to kind of lead. So you have this person in the White House who can just use the power of the presidency to drive implementation of the president's policies. It is shocking that when the president says cybersecurity is a priority, how many federal agencies don't treat it like a priority, because they have their priorities. If the Department of Agriculture, it probably has to do with production and safety of food and agricultural products. And cybersecurity is in there. That's not what the president said. He didn't say have it in there. He said make it a priority, and someone has to do that. So we organized that. We also had to strengthen an organization called the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is shortened to CISA. CISA is the federal agency that's supposed to help all other federal agencies and kind of be the entree into the private sector. And it, for lack of better terminology, was a bit of a dumpster fire. Listen, creating a new, the words like startup and federal government should never be used in the same sentence. The government is not near efficient to run startups. CISA was a startup. Now it was cleaved from all different parts of DHS. DHS is already kind of a Frankenstein abomination. And when you create a Frankenstein inside of Frankenstein, you can imagine it wasn't pretty. But they don't have the right number of people. They don't have the right type of people. They don't have the right kind of infrastructure. They don't have the right authorities in the right places. And so we gave them a lot of changes to get better. And a lot of these weren't, I mean, I'll be clear, we stole other people's ideas about how they should get better and help get them into law. Lots of people understood what was wrong, including people in CISA, including the leadership of CISA said, hey, help me with this law change. So we did, got all these changes done. And so CISA over the next 2 years is going to evolve into a better and better organization. And we did a bunch of other stuff for all the agencies that run infrastructure relationships like energy, treasury. We did law changes there. So the first year was really about getting ourselves smooth. So the second year and getting the DoD stuff right. And now this year, it's about all these other changes in the cybersecurity ecosystem and building the public-private collaboration, kind of some of the stuff you mentioned.
So you mentioned getting the right people into CISA. How is that going? How difficult is it to try to find the right people? Kind of talk to me about where we stand in terms of manpower.
Well, that's a great question. Let me just tell you. So the federal government, this is just jaw-dropping. 23 years ago, when I was at the NSC working this issue, the kind of issue I just took on is, each guy in our office, we were counterterrorism and cyber and critical infrastructure. We each had our own little burden to bear in this. I took on workforce. At the time, we were manned at 65%, which meant, if there was 100,000 jobs, there was just under 100,000 jobs, we had 65,000 of them manned in cybersecurity. The number's a little lower than that. Today, we're manned in the federal government, 63%. So whatever work I did 23 years ago was completely ineffective. And my successors since then have been completely ineffective. And we're not in charge of running it, OPMR and some other organizations, DHS, others. I just want to say that if you were running a military organization and you were 67% manned for 2 years in a row, you'd have new leadership. And if it was a third year in a row, you'd have new leadership. So we're on the 23rd year in a row. And what I would tell you is most of the people involved in it appear to have been rewarded for their great performance, as opposed to held accountable for what is going on here. Now, look, I will say the private sector is the same way. It's manned at about 2/3 of cybersecurity. I would say this, though, in the government, we have a lot more. People joke that, the government's hard to get people. It's not. We have good hiring authorities. We have a great retirement. We have good healthcare. We have good products. We could do this. We just have failed to execute. We created a scholarship for service program in 1999. What that is it's called CyberCore. It's like ROTC. I went through ROTC to be commissioned. My son's in ROTC now. It's ROTC, but better. It pays for room and board as well as your tuition. You do it for 2 to 3 years, and then you owe 3 years to the federal government. In the meantime, you get your clearances while you're in school. You do summer internships that you're paid for in DC or in other federal agencies outside of DC. But the bottom line is you understand, you get to learn your way around the federal government, get your clearance, and then go work for 2 years. This should be an excellent, recruiting and retention device. We pegged it at needing to do about, 1,500 people a year. And today, with current numbers, I'd say 2,000 people a year. Instead, it ramped up and then stuck at 400. It's stuck there because no one was willing to put the money in to get it to 600-800. It's at 80 universities. So kind of like our Navy ROTC is at 60 universities, this thing's at 80 universities, but it could have so much more. Yeah. It could easily produce the 2,000 people we need a year to come into the federal government with either a bachelor's or a master's. And it could really change things. There's other places where we've screwed up in personnel. We're still too tied to bachelor's and master's. There's a lot of federal cybersecurity jobs where a person with the right Microsoft certificates should be able to come in, and even though they don't have a high school degree, a college degree, they should be able to come in as GS 12s or 13s, but they look at the system and go, you don't have a college degree, you must be a GS 10 or 11, and it takes your pay way down. And, so we have some dysfunction there. Even though that's slowly getting fixed, it's only very slowly getting fixed. We have dysfunction in the recruiting and retention programs, and we're stuck at 2/3. And here's the problem. Lots of us have been in military organizations. If you have 2 people in a 3-person organization, several things happen. First of all, you still get 3 people's worth of work. So everybody's working harder. Second problem, after a while of working harder for a long period of time with no change, you get pissed off and morale goes down. And the third thing that kind of people don't think about too much is you never get to go away to training. As a result, you're stuck at the training level you're at. Now, look, If you're, driving a ship or flying an Apache, that might be okay. That you don't go, but if in cybersecurity, I'm not sure it is, but in cybersecurity, I promise you, about every 6 to 12 months, you need to go back for new training.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, you're overworked, unhappy, and undertrained.
Yeah.
That's not the workforce you want. It's not the workforce that'll help you break the paradigm of 2/3 manning. And so it's extremely frustrating to me. And that is one of the top issues. If I have passion for anything in this, it's workforce, and it's getting at this. I'll give you one last thing on it. So we did this report in 1999 that said all this. 2010, a report said the exact same 10 things were wrong. 2015, a report that says the exact 10 things wrong. Our report, we did a special white paper just on the workforce, said the exact same 10 things wrong. Yeah. It is astonishing to me that the government can be consistently so ineffective over 23 years in this area. Whereas if you take like how we man the Air Force for F-15 pilots, or the Navy for nuclear engineers, or the special operators, we use dynamism and creativity and special funding lines, and somehow we maintain a magnificent force in all these different areas to fight all the technical, physical challenges that might be associated with it. And yet we stumble around in the dark in the federal cybersecurity workforce.
So I've seen the Army commercials out there, and they're pretty high speed in terms of trying to recruit people into their sort of technology divisions, and it almost looks like a video game. So I'm sure there's a way to market that to kids that see what's going on out there and may want to help, but don't necessarily want to join the military. So then I guess the question is, if 35% of the public sector and the private sector positions are filled, is that because people still don't, companies and the government still don't think this threat is a big deal? And after the two most recent attacks, have you noticed people starting to change their minds about the cyber threat out there?
We're at 65% manning and 35% gap. Yeah. So yeah, look, there's a few things that go into it. One, it's a hard skill, and not everyone, like a lot of us could be ship drivers in the Navy. A lot of us, there's some exceptions with, vertigo and things, could probably fly. Believe it or not, cybersecurity takes in a certain type of attention and focus and deliberative thing that maybe I'm not good at it. I don't know, to succeed. A little bit of it's that, a little bit of it is it isn't seen as something enjoyable or fun, except to certain people. And then those people we do get in. It isn't universally that way. The Israelis have a great program now they're a completely different society than us, but at their equivalent of like the Iowa exam, someplace in 7th, 8th grade, they administer an exam to all their people. Now everyone's going to get drafted in Israel. And historically, from this test, they're able to like splice off two different groups of people: who's going to be SOF and who's going to be cyber, Unit 8600 for them. And so early on at 7th, 8th grade, they can see from these test results, you have these unique, mental aptitude for these things. And then they recruit them. And look, a nice kind of like forming factor on the recruiting is the idea you're going to get drafted. So you might as well go where they want you, and you get some special pay and higher quality of life. And I'm told now the cyber one's more desirable than the special forces one. But in their country, that's a historical change. So there are ways to get at this. The British test all their kids in 4th or 5th, sometime around 5th or 6th grade for cyber aptitude. I think we should be doing the same thing. In the absence of that, we should be doing cyber education. So we have a program where we've been pushing one of our recommendations called CTAP, which is Cyber Education Training and Assistance Program. But it's the idea of providing curriculum to middle school and high school teachers, to like teach basic cyber hygiene. That's good. So everybody knows, hey, use a complex password, use multi-factor authentication, don't answer any emails from, Nigerian princes, that kind of stuff. And then, but then also it kind of like highlights the uniqueness and value of a cybersecurity vocation. And I think that's important. Both those aspects are important in this program. I was excited about this program. You know, we got 19,000 teachers trained a year. I'm like, that's fantastic. Then I find out like that's the numerator. The denominator is like there's 1 million teachers out there. So suddenly I'm like, okay, well, not so fantastic. But we got to train every teacher every 3 or 4 years. Probably need to be training about 250,000 a year, not 19,000. So we're only about 10% in need. But we're going to work on that program, get it going, get it pushing. But we can't be as agile and speedy as Israel on any issue. But we can bring the kind of aircraft carrier around and, get ourselves positioned to do better. We just haven't done it. 20 years of not doing it. It's worrisome.
Yeah. And what about that Kaseya incident? From the article that I read, it sounds like a couple of years ago, they had an internal report made by their IT department, and it was like something like a 40-page report, basically outlining the kind of the deficiencies in their cybersecurity. And at least what the article said is the people that were involved in that report actually were fired. So my impression is that the companies still don't seem to think that this is as big a threat as maybe they need to be thinking about it.
So two interesting things about Kaseya. First, I never like to give props to your adversary, but a ransomware attack through a software supply chain, that's impressive. And you hit one company up, that hits 10 more companies up, that hits up tens of thousands of customers of those companies. Oh yeah. I mean, it was a brilliant attack. Okay, enough of that. But you're absolutely right. This won't be the only case where you hear afterwards, we were warned and we pressed on anyway. And we might have shot the messenger along the way. That's a frequently heard storyline. But the Kaseya one's pretty brutal because it was recent. And they did have some basic security flaws that are being exposed. Look, most of these stories have some basic security flaws. Look, our adversaries are skilled. I mean, what SolarWinds was done by an exceptionally skilled Russian SVR team with hundreds of people on it. And the way they C2 or command and controlled their penetrations was impressive and hard to detect and therefore not detected initially. And you have to again say props to them for their capabilities they demonstrated. On the other, that one, I'm sorry it happened. We need to work on things. That's a long-term issue. The Kaseya one is a low-hanging fruit fix. You knew there were issues. You're a responsible organization. You are producing software for MSP, for managed service providers. It's absolutely essential that you have good security, and they didn't.
How is our intelligence able to pinpoint who these people are, who these groups are that are doing these attacks? I mean, how can we say that we know that is in fact a Russian agency? And is it that our intelligence is able to track them? Are they leaving clues behind? Are they leaving a tail behind in terms of how their attacks are made? Talk to me a little bit about that.
So part of it's electronic signatures, which are like fingerprints to some degree. Part of it is forensics, backtracking. Part of it is, poor OPSEC by the attacker. Those all go together. Don't get me wrong, though. Attribution, which is when you say somebody did something in cyberspace or other cases, attribution in cyberspace is slow. I mean, we just attributed the Microsoft Exchange server hack on Tuesday to China. It happened 4 months ago or 3.5 months ago. Microsoft attributed 2 months ago. And they had no trouble saying it was China 2 months ago. We were still hemming and hawing. It is very slow. I compare this to say when there's a cruise missile attack into Saudi Arabia or into Iraq, we pin the tail on Iran within 2 to 4 minutes,
right?
Not 2 to 4 months, right? And that's the difference. So the attribution is still very slow. Now, part of it, the slowness kind of gets at the intent of your question, which is that it's hard.
Yeah.
It's harder. It's not like you can't look at overhead imagery and say, well, I see a heat plume there. I can see an object moving through the sky, and then I see a heat plume here. Yeah,
Yeah.
they fired from there onto them onto us at here.
Yeah.
We don't have that kind of track in cyberspace. You know, a good attack is masked by, you know, a dozen or more internal movements between different countries, which, depending on what rule set you're following, may be very hard to follow forensically or in real time.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the big banks earlier, and you know, some of them with $800 million budgets for cybersecurity. I would assume they have some level of an intelligence apparatus within that budget. Are they tracking these players before something happens, or how do they track, and how do they stop any type of potential attack on their systems?
I think the banks are doing several kinds of investments. They're either investing in firewalling, trying to keep people out. That's the basic level. But then for the more advanced criminal, they're running anomalous activity detection. They're looking for unexpected movements inside the server. In other words, there's a presumption you got in. Now, as you try to move around to get access to money, I can see you.
Gotcha.
You're doing something someone in that spot shouldn't have done. You know, I think you'll find that for people who work in banks, you know, when they do something, when they take an action that's unexpected, it's much more likely to trigger a loss of access than, say, you working at your, in a podcast at a studio. When you do something to change the volume that's going to be a bad thing, system doesn't stop you. Yeah. In the banking environment, the software is using machine learning and other tools and rules written for it, attempting to diagnose unusual or unexpected behavior.
Let's get into the CSC report 2020. In that report, you talk about recommendations for the new administration's first 100 days, and then recommendations for 100 days and beyond. So talk to me, how is the Biden administration doing right now?
First thing I'd say is that in the March 20 report, we did get a bunch of stuff done under the Trump administration in that final 100 year of the 116th Congress. So, but you're absolutely right. Those laws are being passed for whoever's next president. Yeah. So you have our report's recommendations plus the 27 provisions of the NDAA that we passed coming into the new president. So how'd they do? The first thing I'd say is a shocking amount of bad stuff happened, starting in November of 2020, December 2020, starting with SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange hack server, pulse check, 2 to 3 ransomware. It's just a bad, a couple of years worth of bad cyber stories in 6 months. So in the context of all the change that we had recommended coming in, all the bad news happening, I think they've done a good job. I tend to say they're trending up. Now look, there's a long way to go up. You can be trending up for a long time before you're neutral, right? We're still pretty far below water. But I think they've done a good job with good selections for senior leadership. In the context of the Biden administration hasn't filled political jobs any faster than the Trump administration, which are both extremely slow. Yeah. They've actually filled their cyber jobs pretty quick. So props for that. Yeah. They've had some executive orders in response to the incidents that happened that I think were useful, as much as executive orders alone can be useful because they don't have the force of law. I think they've implemented the laws we gave them, about 2/3 of them pretty effectively. There's a third where there's still a lot to be determined. They just haven't done anything yet, but the new administration coming in. But so far, their first moves seem to be in the right direction. Probably the biggest thing you can judge somebody on about the commitments, the budget. So the first budget that came in, cybersecurity, Biden 2022 budget, increased 14% cybersecurity. So that's a big number. Now, overall, the non-defense increase was 16%. So 14%, kind of in line with that. The last Trump administration budget was an 11% increase. So that's 2 pretty big increases. And I would tell you, you need double-digit increases in federal, like non-DoD cybersecurity for the next decade, and you probably maybe 6-7 years, and you'd be okay.
Right.
But you don't want to do much more than 14%. You know, if you this is 27% kind of cost average over 2 years. You give them too much more, it's like burning money in a barrel, and I don't want to burn my taxpayer money. So I think they did that about right. So macro, a good budget, but here's the problem. Then you drill into the budget at the micro level. Are they putting the right money in the right places? And a couple of really glaring examples, they didn't. The first is NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. This is the organization that's been charged with figure out how to do zero trust architecture, figure out how to do open source software, figure out how to do the supply chain, change all these software standards and stuff. And this got a 45% budget increase. You're like, happy days. But then you dig like one layer further in the onion, and the cybersecurity division in NIST only got a 5% increase. You're like, you gave them all this extra responsibility, all these new tasks, and a 5% budget increase. I'll cut right to the chase. You're not going to get it all done. This was small potatoes. This was 2 levels down in the onion, and bam, you're at ugly. Yeah. CISA, that agency I talked about, the kind of leading the kind of operational response for the federal government. And again, in a 16% overall increase in the non-DoD federal budget, they only got a 5% increase. Now, Congress has already started to rectify that, and internally is in its budget deliberations has it at about a 20% increase, which is about the max you could do. My point on this is, in the budget, on the surface, a really good budget, but in the details, some self-inflicted wounds. So just a lot to work on, and but I'd say overall trending up, but again against a pretty low bar.
So have they tapped someone to be the director, and have they already been through the approval process with Congress?
The National Cyber Director, and they did.
Okay.
That took a lot of leaning. I would say Senator King leaned heavily, and a man named Chris Inglis, who was the deputy director for the National Security Agency. I'm biased. He was a commissioner on our commission, so to me, he's the perfect American to lead this organization. Right. So I'm excited. So I think, again, they picked a good, the commission's got to be pretty happy when you pick a commissioner to take that top job that we created in law. And they have it. They do have it named a CISA director. You're right, a new one. Her name's Jen Easterly. Okay. I think she's fantastic. She's a retired Army lieutenant colonel, but has done follow-on jobs in the National Security Council for 4 or 5 years in counterterrorism, but has a strong, cyber background. And so I think she'll be fantastic. And they need tough leadership there. And I think bringing in a lieutenant, bringing in an experienced military leader is not a bad thing in that organization.
And is that director, the congressman that you were just mentioning, is that directorship, is that a cabinet level or no?
So it's deputy, I think it's deputy cabinet. It's a member of the National Security Council.
Okay, gotcha.
Senate confirmed. I think it sits in between deputy and cabinet, right? That and U.S. Trade Representative, okay. OMB director, you don't have a cabinet agency, but you're in the National Security Council.
Yeah, so you're basically one degree separated from all the decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And if it's a cyber issue, you're in there. You know what I mean? You're cabinet level, for decision-making purposes.
Yeah. So the attacks that we say are coming from China and Russia and other state players, are we doing enough based on your earlier discussion about the kind of the layers of security and what we need to do to deter other players from doing this? Are we doing enough to Russia and China specifically? Are we saying strongly enough that this is not acceptable? You cannot do this without a certain level of retaliation. Because it seems to me, right now we're basically in a new Cold War in terms of competition for space with China and Russia. And it just seems like the whole cyber space is probably part of that whole kind of Cold War and that whole competition. So is it such that if something were to happen in cyberspace, like a cyber attack, could that translate into actual bullets going down range in a real war type of environment? Or is it more kind of proxy, we do this to you, you do this to us type of a situation?
So That's a great question, and you're hit
I,
right on.
I didn't mean to back you into a corner there.
No, it's the third leg of the stool. No. This is the question I answer most frequently these days, I think, when I'm up on the Hill talking with senators or congressmen, and the answer is complex, but the answer is this is the third leg of the stool. This is what are you going to do to impose costs to discourage or deter future bad behavior, right? The president did the right thing with Putin at the first step. He signaled to him this is unacceptable behavior. And he even told him he didn't need to, but he said there's 16 critical infrastructure, stay away from them. Now here comes the hard part. Signaling is the easy part of deterrence. The hard part's follow-up. The follow-up comes when they then ignore your signaling, and he was signaling on the dark side stuff, from Colonial, and up pops are evil, right? And they're doing ransomware, and the question becomes, what action are you going to take? Now, REvil is no longer operating. So one of three things happened. He called, when he called Putin and said, knock this, I told you to knock it off. Either NSA took him offline because we said we counted to 5 and the Russians didn't do anything, so we did it. The Russians took them offline, the GRU or SVR, because they wanted, or REvil said, it's about time to go offline, pack up our cryptocurrency wallets and go someplace else.
A little close.
Yeah. And the rumor is that we went and grabbed the cryptocurrency money of DarkSide a couple months before. If it's true that we're doing this or we've compelled the Russians to do it, then deterrence is working.
Yeah.
We'll have to see. No one can tell you this answer in 3 months or 6 months. This is a several-year-long question. The China one's a more interesting case. First of all, as we mentioned earlier, the attribution took several months. Here's something neat about the attribution. We got allies and partners to do it with us. That's an important part of creating, kind of shared behavior, the kind of group pushback, and it was the Five Eye countries, Australia, the US, Canada, UK, and NATO and Europe. NATO and the European Union. So it's an interesting pushback. Now, here's the problem. They said it was you, and we named them and shamed China. And then we went a little farther and said, and they've been doing a lot of this. They're bad actors. But what we didn't do, from what I can tell, is economic sanction, impose cost. Now, look, you can't use indictments against China or Russia or North Korea. I think if you indict a North Korean officer for cyber crimes in America, he's going to get an award from Kim Jong-un the next day, hero of North Korea. Yeah. But it's a little different in China and Russia, but you're still not getting anything out of these guys you indict.
You can't indict a government.
Yeah. And so the question then comes, you can do economic sanctions or you can do your own offensive cyber capability. So in China, we should have said, and here are some sanctions we're imposing.
So, and again, this all depends on what side of the aisle you are and what news outlet you talk about. But, when Biden said, hey, listen, we've got these 16 targets, these critical infrastructure targets, they are untouchable. You cannot go anywhere near them. Again, depending on what news source you listen to or read, he was either okay by saying that, or he basically just gave away the whole target list. How bad was that? No.
That's completely inaccurate.
Okay.
It's an unclassified list that's been, I helped write it 23 years ago.
Okay.
So it's not a secret. It's not a state secret, right?
Okay. I wanted to get that clear because again, depending on what news show you.
Hey, let me tell you one thing. Yeah, it's a great point you brought up. I haven't said this all along, and I think I'm actually contractually required to say this in the first 10 minutes of any discussion. This is an inherently bipartisan issue, or even better, nonpartisan issue. Yeah. Senator King, our chairman, he's independent Maine, caucuses with Democrats. He'd routinely slip me a note during meetings, he wouldn't know with the 6 civilian commissioners who appointed them. Were they appointed by Republicans or Democrats? He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember the one his own Senate Democrats, and that's great.
Yeah.
Because you could not tell someone's politics from their opinion. We reached unanimous consensus on 82 of 83 issues. Yeah. It's just a phenomenal You don't get that anywhere else. And then not just consensus, like some people gave in, like it wasn't exactly what they wanted, but they went along with it because it's cybersecurity. And then they became our advocates and helped sell it. Some of the people who I knew disagreed with tenets of what we were arguing were the most vociferous and aggressive advocates on the Hill, because they knew it was part of a total package of cybersecurity change. So it is a inherently nonpartisan. Look, I don't know how much longer that can last. You know what I mean? Because we're in a very polarized environment right now. The last few days, even more so. But John Katko, Representative John Katko from New York, he's a Republican, ranking member of the Homeland Security. He and Jim Langevin sponsored 20 things together last year, and they'll sponsor another 20 together this year. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican, one's very progressive, one's kind of a moderate conservative, and they have no problems on cybersecurity coming together and jamming things through.
So we're coming up on our time, and I really appreciate the conversation today. Last question. So how do you think we're doing now? What do we need to do moving forward? And what will need to happen for us to stop the next cyber attack?
So I have in my mind, there's two ways forward. One, both of them aren't great, right? Both of them get to the final place we need to be. The question is, how painful is it getting there? We are either, our final place to be is where the government is well organized, the government is building resilient, protected systems for itself, the government is working to raise the cybersecurity, the overall ecosphere, economic, cyber ecosphere in the United States, and very explicitly, we're working to build that public-private collaboration. And we can get there one of two ways. We can get there kind of iteratively, like we are right now, trying to, with being kind of like pushed along by adversary malicious behavior, activity, but getting there. Right. Or we can have like a dramatic event, people like to say Cyber 9/11, but something where we lose like the East Coast electrical power grid, goes down for 2 or 3 days, and then as it comes back up, a secondary attack hits it, or tertiary attack, and it's down for a week, 10 days. And we lose hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of GDP. We lose our credibility in running international exchanges, which all run out of the New York, New Jersey, many, a disproportionate amount of world economic power is run by the United States. And that's only acceptable because we run it credibly and reliably. Well, we suddenly lose the grid in the Northeast for a week. That credible and reliable is going to go away. And you're going to see the Chinese and Singapore and Japan and Brussels and the European Union and in London saying, hey, let's distribute some of that strength. And that's important to us because the United States is a militarily strong country, but the strength of the United States derives from our economic power. And so protecting that's critical. I haven't talked about it, but one of our biggest recommendations is something called continuity of the economy. And that's the idea, like there's something called continuity of the operations, continuity of the government. That's, if you ever watched like Kiefer Sutherland's, his TV show, Designated Survivor, that's all about that. And the military kind of runs that with Secret Service and a few other agencies to keep the government going in a crisis. What we don't have is how do you keep the economy going when you lose this Northeast power grid? So, but back on this, if we have a traumatic event, we'll get there. That's not the way to get there. We didn't need to solve, this goes back to in pre 9/11. How do you solve the intelligence collection problem between the CIA and FBI? Well, you could have done it iteratively, slowly over time, gotten it done, or you could have 9/11 and you get it done a week later, right? I prefer to do it the iterative way where we're working together, we're being driven, we're like there's something nipping at our heels, but we're moving. I'd prefer that to the baseball bat to the side of my head. Now reorganize yourself. By the way, you don't do a great job with that baseball bat, right? DHS, Department of Homeland Security.
You're in reactive mode.
Reactive
mode, panic mode.
Yeah.
It's that whole concept of being fat, dumb, and happy, and you think you're totally fine. That's when you need to be worried.
That's what, So I think I like the nipping at the heels approach where we're moving iteratively and getting there, and we can get there in two to 3 years. Well,
I'll tell you what, Mark, thank you very much for your time. Again, this was Mark Montgomery from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Great information, and I really appreciate your time. I'm going to end up by saying this. If you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, stay safe. Thank you very much for your service. We really appreciate it. Mark Montgomery, this was a pleasure. I really appreciate it, sir. Okay, guys, this is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.